This is 1839 in South Carolina. There was a man named James Henry Hammond who just bought 2 enslaved people. Sally Johnson, who was 18 years old, and her daughter Louisa, who was just a baby, 1 year old. Hammond was 32 years old at the time. He was married to a woman named Catherine Fitzsimmons. They had children together. He owned a massive plantation called Silver Bluff near Augusta, Georgia. He'd been a congressman. He was working his way up through South Carolina politics. He was wealthy, educated, ambitious. He had everything a man in the antebellum South could want. But here's the thing about James Henry Hammond. He kept a diary, a detailed, brutally honest diary where he wrote down everything: his thoughts, his actions, his desires, his crimes. He wrote it all down with this remarkable lack of shame or self-awareness. He seemed to genuinely believe he was the hero of his own story, that everything he did was justified, that he had nothing to hide. Those diaries weren't published until 1988. For over a century after his death, Hammond was remembered as a controversial figure. Sure, but also as an important political leader. People knew there were rumors about his personal life. But it wasn't until his own words were made public that everyone understood the full extent of what he'd done. And what he'd done was horrific. Let's start with how he got his wealth. James Henry Hammond was born poor in 1807. His father was a schoolteacher from Massachusetts who'd moved to South Carolina. The family didn't have money or social standing. Hammond knew from a young age that if he wanted power and wealth, he'd have to get it somehow. He was smart, really smart. He went to South Carolina College, won academic prizes, studied law. He got admitted to the bar in 1828 and started practicing in Columbia. He also started a newspaper to promote nullification, which was a big political issue at the time. He was making connections, building a reputation, positioning himself for success. But he knew that education and talent would only take him so far. In the South Carolina of the 1830s, real power came from owning land and enslaved people. That's what made someone part of the planter class. That's what gave you political influence and social standing. Hammond needed wealth, and he needed it fast. And then in 1831, when he was 24 years old, he married Catherine Fitzsimmons. She was 17. She was described as shy and plain. She wasn't beautiful or charming or particularly interesting by the accounts we have. But she came from the powerful Hampton family, one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. Her dowry was substantial. Through that marriage, Hammond acquired about 11,000 acres of land and 147 enslaved people. Just like that, he went from being a poor lawyer to being a wealthy planter. He didn't build that wealth himself. He didn't earn it through his own work. He married into it. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to prove he was a self-made man, that his success came from his own abilities rather than from marrying into wealth. This is important to understand because it shaped everything that came after. Hammond always had this insecurity about being new money, about not being born into the planter aristocracy. He compensated by being more extreme than anyone else in defending the system. He wrote more detailed plantation manuals. He argued more aggressively for slavery. He tried harder to dominate and control everything and everyone around him. He was constantly trying to prove he belonged at the top of the hierarchy. He ran Silver Bluff Plantation with strict control. He wrote detailed manuals about how to manage enslaved people. He had rules for everything: their clothing, their quarters, their food, their work schedules, even their marriages and child rearing. He aimed to be, as one historian put it, the quintessential patriarch, controlling every aspect of life on his plantation. He regulated their religion, deciding when they could worship and what they could believe. He controlled their marriages, deciding who could marry whom. He controlled their families, deciding when mothers could nurse their infants and for how long. He even controlled their private lives, as we'll see. Nothing happened on his plantation without his approval. Every detail of every enslaved person's life was subject to his rules and his authority. Hammond promoted Silver Bluff as an example of the perfectly run plantation. He was proud of his manual. He thought it showed how rational and benevolent slavery could be when managed correctly. He actually believed that his detailed rules about pregnant women being allowed to nurse for 12 months, or old people being given lighter work, proved that he was a humane slave owner. But his control methods had a cost. The mortality rate among the enslaved people on his plantations was appallingly high, especially in the early years. He worked people to death. The labor demands were so intense, the conditions were so harsh, that people died at rates far above average even for slavery. And in his diary, he'd note things like, 2 deaths among my Negroes since the 25th, and then immediately follow it with, another heavy loss, my favorite mare, the best animal I ever owned. Read that again. He put the death of his favorite horse in the same entry as the deaths of enslaved people. Actually, he seemed more upset about the horse. That's how he saw enslaved people, as property, as animals, sometimes as less valuable than animals. His horse was his favorite. The enslaved people were just losses to be noted and replaced. In 1839, he bought Sally Johnson. She was 18 years old and came with her baby daughter Louisa. He made Sally his mistress immediately. He forced himself on her. Let's be clear about what that means here. An enslaved woman cannot consent to her owner. She has no power to refuse. She has no legal protection. What Hammond did to Sally Johnson was repeated assault and exploitation. He fathered several children with Sally. In his diary and in letters to his son, he acknowledged this. He wrote about these children matter-of-factly, as if this was just a normal part of plantation life, which, terrifyingly, it was for many enslavers. But Hammond wrote it down. He documented his own crimes with this casual attitude that makes it all the more disturbing. Sally's daughter Louisa was 1 year old when Hammond bought them. She grew up on Hammond's plantation, watching her mother be harmed by the man who owned them both. And when Louisa turned 12 years old in 1850, Hammond started forcing himself on her too. 12 years old. Think about that. A child who'd been on his plantation since she was a baby. A child he'd watched grow up. A child whose mother he'd been assaulting for 11 years. And when she reached 12, he decided she was old enough to become his victim too. Louisa had no childhood. She grew up watching her mother be hurt. She grew up knowing that the same fate awaited her, and when it came, when Hammond decided she was old enough, there was nothing she could do. No one to appeal to, no protection, no escape. She bore his children. Multiple children, starting when she was barely a teenager herself. And then Hammond's son Harry started forcing himself on her too, so she was being harmed by a father and son, bearing children and not knowing which of them was the father, living in a nightmare where her body wasn't her own, where she had no control, no choice, no hope of it ever ending. Hammond's wife Catherine knew about Sally. She'd tolerated it, as many wives of slaveholders had to tolerate their husbands' mistreatment of enslaved women. The system gave them no power to stop it. The system told them to look away, to accept it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But when Hammond started harming Louisa, Catherine finally had enough. She gave him an ultimatum: sell Sally and Louisa, or she would leave him and take their children with her. Think about what that took. In 1850 South Carolina, wives didn't leave their husbands. Marriage was for life. Divorce was nearly impossible. A woman who left her husband faced social ruin. She'd lose access to her children if her husband fought for custody. She'd lose her social standing. She'd be dependent on her family to take her in and support her. Everything in the system was designed to keep wives trapped in marriages no matter what. And Catherine left anyway. She actually packed up, took their children, and went to live with her family. That tells you how horrific the situation was. That tells you that even in a system that normalized so much brutality, even for a woman who'd been forced to accept her husband mistreating Sally for 11 years, the harm to a 12-year-old child was too much. Hammond refused to sell them. So Catherine left. She actually left him, took their children, and went to live with her family. This was a huge scandal in South Carolina society. Wives didn't leave their husbands. The fact that she did this tells you how serious the situation was, how much even Catherine, who'd been forced to tolerate so much, couldn't tolerate this. Hammond blamed Catherine's mother for the separation. In his diary, he wrote, "I trace it all to the horrible connection which Satan seduced me into forming with the vulgar Fitzsimmons family, whose low Irish descent and hypocrisy can only be compared with their low Irish pride, selfishness, and utter want of refinement and tone. This is the family whose money had made him wealthy, the family whose connections had launched his political career. And he called them vulgar and blamed them for his own actions. He couldn't accept responsibility for anything. It always had to be someone else's fault." Catherine and Hammond reconciled in 1853, 3 years later. But the way they reconciled tells you everything about how the system worked. Hammond didn't agree to stop what he was doing. Instead, he transferred ownership of them. He gave Louisa to Catherine's mother as a gift. He gave Sally and her children to his son Harry. And here's where it gets even worse, if that's possible. Harry had apparently also been harming Louisa. So Hammond transferred Louisa to his mother-in-law and Sally to his son, who'd also been hurting her daughter. In an 1856 letter to Harry, Hammond wrote about Sally and Louisa and their children. He acknowledged that some of Louisa's children might be his, some might be Harry's. He wrote, "Take care of her and her children who are both of your blood, if not of mine. Both of your blood, if not of mine." He's telling his son to take care of children who might be his grandchildren or might be his own children. Children born from his exploitation of a woman, and then his harm of her daughter, who his son was also exploiting. And then Hammond wrote, "I cannot free these people and send them north. It would be cruelty to them, nor would I like that any but my own blood should own as slaves my own blood or Louisa. I leave them to your charge, believing that you will best appreciate and most independently carry out my wishes in regard to them." He refused to free them. He said it would be cruelty to free them and send them north. He wanted to keep them enslaved, but only by family members, because he didn't want strangers owning his own children. And he seemed to genuinely believe this was him being thoughtful and caring, that keeping his own children enslaved was somehow protecting them. In another letter he wrote, "Do not let Louisa or any of my children or possible children be the slaves of strangers. Slavery in the family will be their happiest earthly condition. Their happiest earthly condition. Keeping his own children, and Louisa, who he'd been harming since she was 12, in slavery. Passing them between family members like property, and he convinced himself this was for their benefit. But Hammond's crimes weren't limited to Sally and Louisa. In the early 1840s, while he was governor of South Carolina, he behaved inappropriately with his 4 teenage nieces. These were the daughters of his brother-in-law, Wade Hampton II. They were between 13 and 18 years old. They were his wife's nieces. They were staying in his home. Hammond described them in his diary as lovely and luscious. He wrote about how they were extremely affectionate toward him, how they would rush into his arms and cover him with kisses, loll on his lap, press their bodies against his. He described their dalliances and familiarities in detail, and then he blamed them for leading him on. He literally wrote that these teenage girls were so affectionate and seductive that he couldn't help himself. He acted inappropriately toward them for about 2 years. Eventually, one of them, a 19-year-old, told her father what had been happening. Wade Hampton II was furious. He confronted Hammond and made the scandal public. This destroyed Hammond's political career for about a decade. He was ostracized by South Carolina society. He lost Senate races in 1846 and 1850 because of the scandal. But here's what's important to understand. The scandal destroyed the nieces' lives far more than it destroyed Hammond's. In that society, victims of inappropriate conduct were blamed. The girls were seen as tarnished, as having damaged reputations. None of the 4 ever married. Their lives and prospects were ruined because their uncle had harmed them and then blamed them for it. Hammond, meanwhile, eventually rehabilitated his political career. By the late 1850s, the scandal had faded enough that he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1857. He served from 1857 to 1860. He became one of the most outspoken defenders of slavery in the entire country. His election to the Senate came at a crucial time. The country was moving toward civil war. The debates over slavery were intensifying. Kansas was bleeding. John Brown had raided Harper's Ferry. The Republican Party was gaining strength in the North with its anti-slavery platform. The South felt under siege, and men like Hammond became its most aggressive defenders. On March 4, 1858, he gave his most famous speech to the Senate. This is where he said, "Cotton is king." He argued that the South's cotton economy was so important that no one would dare make war on it. He said, "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king." He believed this completely. He thought the South's economic power made it invulnerable. He thought the North and Britain and the rest of the world needed Southern cotton so badly that they'd never seriously challenge slavery. He was arguing that economic might created political immunity, that the South could do whatever it wanted because the world economy depended on Southern cotton. He was wrong, of course. The North did make war on cotton. The Civil War happened. The South lost. But in 1858, Hammond was confident. He was standing in the U.S. Senate, a respected senator, making arguments that other senators took seriously. And while he was making these arguments, Sally and Louisa were still enslaved. His own children were still enslaved. The 12-year-old he'd been exploiting was now 19 and still his property. In that same speech, he laid out his views on slavery and society. He said, "In all social systems, There must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government. He called enslaved people the mudsill of society, the foundation that everything else was built on. And he argued that there had to be an inferior class to do the hard labor, so that superior people could have civilization and refinement. He described enslaved black people as a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. This was the same man who was exploiting Sally Johnson and her 12-year-old daughter. The same man who'd acted inappropriately with his teenage nieces. The same man who was keeping his own children in slavery. And he was standing in the U.S. Senate arguing that this was all justified, all natural, all part of God's plan. Because yes, Hammond also claimed religious justification for slavery. He wrote, "I firmly believe that American slavery is not only not a sin, but especially commanded by God through Moses and approved by Christ through his apostles." He went to church. He prayed. He read the Bible. And he convinced himself that God wanted him to own other human beings, to harm the women he owned, to keep his own children enslaved. Hammond also rejected Thomas Jefferson's famous line from the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "I repudiate as ridiculously absurd that much lauded but nowhere accredited dogma of Mr. Jefferson, that all men are born equal." That's what he believed. That's what he argued publicly. That's what he built his entire political career on, the idea that some people were inherently inferior and could therefore be owned, controlled, used, and mistreated. When the Civil War started in 1861, Hammond was already out of the Senate. He'd resigned in 1860 when South Carolina seceded. He spent the war years on his plantation, complaining about Confederate policies. When Confederate officials tried to requisition his enslaved people or his grain, he refused and complained bitterly in his diary. At one point, when a Confederate officer presented him with a requisition order, Hammond tore it up, threw it out the window, and wrote in his diary that it was like branding on my forehead, "Slave." He compared being asked to contribute supplies to the Confederate war effort to being enslaved himself. He, a man who'd enslaved over 300 people, who'd mistreated multiple enslaved women, who'd kept his own children in bondage, he felt victimized when asked to share his grain. Hammond died on November 13th, 1864, 2 days before his 57th birthday. He died at his plantation, just weeks before Union forces reached the area. He never faced any consequences for what he'd done to Sally, to Louisa, to his nieces, to the hundreds of people he'd enslaved. He lived out his life in wealth and comfort, writing in his diary about his various complaints and grievances, convinced until the end that he was a victim of circumstances rather than a perpetrator of atrocities. His diaries remained private for over a century after his death. His family kept them. Historians knew they existed, but couldn't access them. When researcher Carol Bleeser finally got permission to publish them in 1988, the full extent of Hammond's crimes became public for the first time. And here's what's remarkable about those diaries. Hammond wrote everything down with this stunning lack of shame. He documented his own mistreatment of others, his own moral bankruptcy, and he did it in a tone that suggested he thought he was being honest and admirable by writing it all down. He seemed to think that posterity would understand him, would see things from his perspective, would recognize that he was just a man doing what men of his class and time did. He was wrong. Reading his diaries now is like looking into the mind of someone who has completely rationalized evil, who has convinced himself that harming others is just taking what's owed to him, that hurting children was the fault of seductive teenagers, that enslaving his own children was protecting them, that systematic brutality was efficient management. The diaries reveal a man who was narcissistic, self-pitying, morally blind, and completely convinced of his own superiority. He believed he was, as he put it, head and shoulders above everyone around him. He thought his intellect and education made him special, made him deserving of power and privilege. And in the system he lived in, he was right about one thing: he did have that power. The system gave him absolute control over the people he enslaved. The system let him exploit Sally and Louisa with no consequences. The system let him keep his own children as property. The system allowed him to behave inappropriately with his nieces, and then, after a brief period of scandal, continue his political career. That's what slavery enabled. Men like Hammond could do essentially whatever they wanted to the people they owned. They could harm them, separate families, force relationships, anything. And it was all legal. It was all within their rights as property owners. Sally Johnson lived her entire adult life being harmed by James Henry Hammond. We don't know what happened to her after she was given to his son Harry. The records don't tell us. She disappears from history after Hammond's letters. Just another enslaved woman whose story was lost. Louisa spent her childhood watching her mother be hurt, and then became a victim herself at 12 years old. She was taken advantage of by Hammond for years. Then she was also harmed by his son Harry. Then she was given to Hammond's mother-in-law like a piece of furniture. She bore multiple children who were fathered by either Hammond or his son, or possibly both. And she had no choice in any of it. No control over her own body, her own life, her own children. We don't know what happened to those children either. The ones Hammond and Harry fathered with Sally and Louisa. Hammond wrote about them in his letters, acknowledged them as his blood, made arrangements for their care, but only arrangements that kept them enslaved, only arrangements that treated them as property rather than as his children. The 4 Hampton nieces never married. Their uncle's misconduct destroyed their social prospects. In a society that blamed victims, they were seen as tarnished. They spent their lives living with the shame of what had been done to them and the injustice of being blamed for it. And Hammond? He served in Congress, served as governor, served as U.S. Senator. He gave influential speeches. He wrote pro-slavery treatises. He was taken seriously as a political philosopher. The Mudsill speech was widely quoted and debated. People knew his name, respected his intellect, listened to his arguments. That's the system. That's how it worked. A man could exploit the women he enslaved, harm a 12-year-old child, behave inappropriately with his teenage nieces, keep his own children in bondage, and still be respected, still hold office, still be seen as a legitimate voice in national debates. The only reason we know the full truth about Hammond now is because he wrote it down himself. He documented his own crimes, and even then, those documents stayed hidden for over a century. If his diaries hadn't been published, he'd still be remembered as just another controversial antebellum politician. The specifics of what he did to Sally, to Louisa, to his nieces, would have remained as rumors rather than documented fact. James Henry Hammond died in 1864. He never faced trial, never faced punishment, never even faced real social consequences for most of what he did. The brief scandal about his nieces interrupted his political career for a few years. but even that eventually faded. Sally Johnson and Louisa were enslaved for their entire lives under Hammond's ownership, then under his son's ownership. They had no freedom, no choice, no control over their own bodies or lives. We don't know when they died or what happened to their children. The four Hampton nieces lived out their lives as unmarried women, bearing the shame and social consequences of what their uncle had done to them. Hammond's legitimate children inherited his wealth, his property, his legacy, the plantation that had been built on the labor and suffering of over 300 enslaved people. The system that enabled all of this continued until the Civil War ended it by force. Not because people suddenly decided it was wrong, not because the horror of what men like Hammond were doing became too much to tolerate, but because a war was fought and the North won. Hammond's diaries sat in archives for over a century. Historians knew they existed, but couldn't fully access them. When they were finally published in 1988, they revealed the full extent of his actions in his own words. No speculation needed, no relying on rumors or accusations. Hammond had written it all down himself, and he genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. He blamed everyone else, the teenage girls for being tempting, his wife's family for being vulgar, Confederate officials for being tyrannical. He saw himself as a victim, as someone who'd been misunderstood and mistreated. That's what makes reading his diaries so disturbing. It's not just what he did, though that's deeply troubling on its own. It's his complete inability to see himself as anything other than the hero of his own story. His total moral blindness, his absolute certainty in his own righteousness, even as he recorded cruelty after cruelty. This is what slavery did to people, not just to the enslaved, though obviously they suffered the most, but to the enslavers too. It corrupted everything it touched. It created men who could deeply harm others and call it natural, who could keep their own children as property and call it kindness, who could argue that some human beings weren't really human and have that argument taken seriously by other educated, powerful people. Hammond wasn't unique. He was extreme in some ways, yes. Most slave owners didn't document their lives so openly. Most didn't rise to the level of U.S. Senator. But what he did, the forced relationships, the exploitation of young girls, the keeping of his own children as property, these weren't unique to him. These were patterns that happened throughout the South on countless plantations, by countless enslavers. The difference is that we have Hammond's diaries. We have his own words documenting it all. We have proof that can't be dismissed or explained away. He wrote it down himself, in his own handwriting, in documents that are now held by the Library of Congress. Sally Johnson was 18 when Hammond bought her. She spent her life being controlled and taken advantage of by the man who owned her. We don't even know her full story. We only know about her because Hammond wrote about her. Her own voice is lost. Her own perspective is gone. We can't know what she thought, what she felt, what she wanted, what she hoped for. Did she love her daughter? Of course she did. Did she try to protect Louisa? How could she? What could she do when the man who owned them both decided Louisa was old enough to be controlled the same way she had been? Sally had no power, no options, no way to save her daughter from the same fate she'd endured. Did Sally have other children beyond Louisa and the ones Hammond fathered? Did she have family elsewhere? Did she have dreams of freedom? Did she ever hope that things might change? We don't know. The records don't tell us. Hammond wrote about her as property, as someone he controlled, as the mother of his children. But who was she really? What was her life like beyond the suffering she was forced to endure? These are questions we can't answer because slavery was designed to erase these stories, to erase these voices, to make sure that all we had left were the words of the enslavers, the perspectives of the people with power, the justifications of the system that benefited them. Louisa was a baby when she arrived at Hammond's plantation. She grew up there. She was 12 when Hammond began to exploit her. We don't know anything about her beyond what Hammond wrote. We don't know if she had dreams, if she had friends, if she loved anyone, if anyone loved her beyond her mother. We don't know what she thought about her life or what she hoped might happen. We only know what was done to her. She had multiple children fathered by Hammond, starting when she was barely a teenager. Later, she had more children connected to Hammond's son, Harry, and we don't even know how many children in total or what became of them. Hammond mentioned some of them in his letters, acknowledging they were his blood, making arrangements for their care, but only arrangements that kept them enslaved, only arrangements that passed them between family members like property. Did those children know Hammond was their father? Did they know Harry was their father or half-brother or both? How did they make sense of their place in that house, in that family, in that system? We don't know. Their stories are lost too. The 4 Hampton nieces at least have names, though Hammond recorded them in his diary, and I won't repeat them here. They lived their whole lives with what their uncle had done to them. Never married. Never had the chance to build their own families or lives. Destroyed by actions that were then blamed on them. Hammond's legitimate children inherited wealth built on slavery. They grew up in comfort and privilege. When Hammond died, they got his property, his money, his position. They didn't inherit his crimes, but they certainly benefited from the system that had enabled those crimes. The story of James Henry Hammond matters because it shows us what slavery really was in practice. Not the sanitized version, not the Gone with the Wind romance, but the reality, brutality, exploitation, the treating of human beings as property, the systematic destruction of families, the twisted moral logic that let men convince themselves that evil was good. It matters because Hammond was powerful. He was a governor, a senator, an influential thinker. People listened to him. His arguments about slavery were taken seriously. His mudsill speech was widely discussed and debated. He wasn't some fringe figure. He was part of the South's political establishment, a representative of its highest class. And all the while, he was documenting his own monstrous behavior in his diary, writing about forcing himself on Sally and Louisa, writing about behaving inappropriately with his nieces, writing about his political theories and his plantation management and his various grievances. All of it together, all of it justified in his own mind, all of it part of the same worldview where some people were fully human and others were property. But here's what makes Hammond's story particularly important. He wasn't unusual in what he did. The exploitation of enslaved women by their owners was commonplace. The mistreatment of young girls, including the children of enslaved women, happened throughout the South. The keeping of one's own children in slavery was a direct result of the system's logic. These weren't aberrations. These were features of slavery, not exceptions. What was unusual was that Hammond wrote it all down. Most enslavers didn't document their crimes in such detail. Most didn't keep diaries where they casually mentioned hurting 12-year-olds and forcing their sons to manage the children born from those relationships. Most kept their abuse more private, more hidden, more deniable. Hammond's honesty, if you can call it that, gives us a window into the mindset of the enslaver class, into how they justified what they did, into how they convinced themselves they were good men, moral men, Christian men, while doing things that we now recognize as evil. He genuinely believed he was protecting Sally and Louisa by keeping them enslaved in the family. He genuinely believed that slavery was their happiest earthly condition. He genuinely believed that refusing to free his own children was kindness rather than cruelty. He'd so thoroughly internalized the logic of slavery that he couldn't see the horror of what he was doing. The diaries were finally published in 1988. Over a century after Hammond's death, the world finally got to read his own account of what he'd done, got to see his moral bankruptcy in his own words, got to understand that the man who'd stood in the U.S. Senate defending slavery was also harming a 12-year-old child and seeing no contradiction between those two things. The publication of those diaries changed how historians understood the antebellum South. Before 1988, much of what was known about Hammond's personal life came from rumors and accusations that his defenders could dismiss as politically motivated attacks. But once his own words were made public, once he was documented in his own handwriting, admitting to everything, there was no way to explain it away or minimize it. Carol Bleezer, the historian who edited and published the diaries, noted that Hammond had a strange compulsion to record everything. Like President Nixon with his White House tapes, Hammond seemed to have this need to document his thoughts and actions, even when doing so created evidence of his own crimes. He wrote as if he believed posterity would understand him, would see things from his perspective, would recognize that he was just a product of his time and place. He was wrong. Reading his diaries now doesn't make us understand or sympathize with him. It makes us horrified. It shows us exactly how moral corruption works, how systems of oppression warp the minds of the oppressors, how evil can present itself as normal and natural and even benevolent. That's the value of having these documents. Not to excuse Hammond or explain him away, but to understand how slavery functioned at the personal level. To see how enslavers justified their actions to themselves. To recognize that they weren't cartoon villains who knew they were evil. They were people who'd convinced themselves they were good, who'd built elaborate moral frameworks to justify cruelty, who'd internalized the system so completely that they couldn't see its horror. That's the legacy. Not just what he did, but what the system allowed him to do. Not just his crimes, but how he was rewarded for them. Not just his abuse, but how he faced no consequences and ended up respected and powerful anyway. James Henry Hammond died in his bed on his plantation, wealthy and comfortable, convinced he was a victim of circumstances rather than a perpetrator of evil. He never faced justice. He never made amends. He never even seemed to understand that what he'd done was wrong. Sally and Louisa died enslaved, their stories mostly lost, their voices silenced, their suffering documented only through the words of the man who'd inflicted that suffering. The 4 nieces died as spinsters, their lives ruined by what had been done to them. And the system that enabled all of it continued until it was destroyed by force. That's the story. That's what happened. That's what we have to remember. Not the myths about benevolent masters and happy slaves, but the documented reality of men like James Henry Hammond, who kept diaries recording their crimes and never understood they were crimes at all.